Dave, I appreciate you doing this, man.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Man, your book, NBA 75 Years. Tremendous read, man. Very straightforward. No subliminal messages. The type of books I love. You give a chronological and a great illustration throughout the book of different stories in the history of the game. If you could you just explain the writing process and the whole background of how this project was made?
Yeah, absolutely. So it started with the idea being we're coming on the 75th anniversary of the NBA. How to best capture that? And what we decided to do was make a book where it's 75 stories for 75 years. So the idea was generally to have one story per year. I don't know if it didn't quite work out to be one per year exactly like that, but just starting from the beginning till now, charting the history of the league and telling it through the characters who made the NBA what it is, the coaches, the players. These really, it was important for me to make it character driven. So while we're talking about basketball, we're talking about the game. Really, at the core of it all are the people who are involved. We're telling their stories, their life stories, which for a lot of these guys are just fascinating. And for some of the older players in particular, the older figures, I think it's only natural, but I think they kind of get lost through time, you know? So it was really important for me to be able to tell those stories, particularly like the first half of the book. I think I enjoyed writing the process throughout for all 75 chapters, but the first half was really fulfilling for me because I felt like we're putting down these stories that people might not know. Maybe they know some of the characters, maybe they know parts of it, but they might not know this entire story. So here's our opportunity to kind of bring that back to light.
Well said, man. Were there any other parts of the book or like chapters that you wanted to add in stories from the past that you want to say, hey, I want to put this, but it didn't make the cut, or like you already had your story that you want to write?
You know, it's funny. Like, so it started with just let's put a list down of all the good stories we want to tell. Let's see if it adds up to 75, or maybe it adds up to 150. We have to cut out, and we had a bunch on there. My fear was as we were writing it, once we locked into the table of contents, more or less, we locked into the stories we're going to have. I would have like sleepless nights where I would think like there must be like a really obvious, huge story that I've just forgotten about that should be in here that's not. Fortunately, I think we did a good job of capturing it all. There's nothing really that I think we didn't put in there that I would have liked to put in. One thing I'm really proud of with this book are that while I hope it's a good read for all basketball fans, non-basketball fans, for a real general audience. But for me, selfishly, I really wanted to talk about the ABA a lot back in the 60s and 70s, the kind of rival league to the NBA. And we have like 3 or 4 different stories that touches on ABA history. And that for me that's always been like something I gravitated towards. And so to be able to have those ABA stories in this book was really exciting for me. Yeah. But I don't know, there's probably stuff that I'll think of like as the years go on. Damn, I wish I could have got that in there.
Yeah.
I grew up in Toronto. Vince Carter was a huge figure. I would have had a chapter on his performance at the dunk contest. So maybe that's what I would have liked to have in. But when you start trying to encapsulate like the entire history of the league, you start to realize like maybe your favorite moments might not be the most important moments in the history of shaping the league.
Absolutely. Well, if you don't mind, I just want to go do a few chapters of the book.
Awesome.
We can start with 1962, The Legends of Wilt. Now, there's like very few images or few visualizations of Wilt. Can you just give a brief summary of who he was and how much impact he played and how his game probably would have relate to 21st century basketball?
How his game would have related, I think, is really interesting because, first of all, Wilt, I think, is one of those guys who I was like, going into this was like, I really want to make sure we get across how insane this guy's abilities were and his feats in the NBA. Because when we start talking about the greatest ever, Wilt doesn't really come up as often as he should be. I think he should be right up there in the conversation. Okay, a brief overview of Wilt Chamberlain. He was a 7-footer in an age where there weren't 7-footers, so it gave him a huge advantage. But he was more than just a big guy. He was a world-class athlete. He was like a record-setting track and field guy in college. I think he set the record for the triple jump as a 7-footer. He would like famously like take coins off the top of the backboard, all that kind of stuff. I mean, he was a freak athlete, a terrible free throw shooter. For a while, he was trying to overcome that by just taking a step and dunking from the free throw line. No run up, just like a gather step and dunking from the free throw line. And they had to put in a rule saying you have to actually shoot the ball, even though he was the only guy in the league who could do that. So I'm just trying to give you an idea of the level of athleticism this guy had. And it was a big reason why he dominated. Mm-hmm. He has a million records. They're in the book. It's hard for me to keep track of all of them. Obviously, scoring 100 points is his most famous. But he also has a record. He grabbed 55 rebounds in a game, and that was against the Celtics, matching up against Bill Russell, who's considered like the greatest defensive center of his era. So he was just dominant. He was also an interesting character because he was really motivated and fueled by what people said about him. And to wit, people called him selfish. So the next season he led the league in assists. That was kind of his approach. And people wonder if his obsession with his perception and numbers and whatnot got in the way of him winning. Because he won, I think, 2 championships, one towards the end of his career with the Lakers and one with Philly kind of in his prime. But he could have won a lot more. I guess Russell and the Celtics had a lot to do with that. But he's just an interesting figure from that perspective. And I always wonder about how he would fit in today. Because now the Wilt Chamberlain type, the 7-foot uber athletic guy, it's pretty common in the NBA. I'm not saying if he were here today, he'd just be like another center, because I think he still was supremely talented. He was a great basketball player. He had a really good touch on his jumper. He had like these hook shots and these fadeaway turnaround jumpers from the post that were literally unguardable then, and I think still would be really difficult to guard today. So I would like to think that he'd be just as dominant today, but we're in an era where centers aren't what they used to be. So it's one of the more fascinating questions is how would Wilt fare today? I think he'd still be an all-timer.
Right, because wasn't there a time he had an offer of he want to play for the ABA team, the San Quistadors, or
yeah. So everyone wanted Wilt to play for him, and so the ABA was a league that tried to lure NBA stars by just offering them a lot more money. It turns out that a lot of those big contracts they were offering were deferred payments. So it's like, hey, you can make $500,000 with us, or you can make $45,000 in the NBA. But what people didn't realize, what a lot of players didn't realize, was that $500,000 was spread out over like 40 years. So it's really, they weren't really making the money that they thought they were. But Wilt was getting offers to play everywhere. He got an offer before he went to college to play for the Harlem Globetrotters. And he ended up playing for them before he was ever in the NBA. So we talk about that in the book a little bit. The Globetrotters are really going after Wilt hard, and he played for them. He played for them instead of going to the NBA because they offered a lot more money, and because the Globetrotters at that time, we're talking like early 60s, that was where the best black basketball players went to play. It wasn't in the NBA. And I think one of the things that I hope comes across in the book is kind of how shocking it is at how white the league was at first. Maybe it's not shocking, but also how slow and hesitant they were to integrating. Mm-hmm. We think about what the NBA represents today. They were leaders in trying to get the Black Lives Matter message across in the bubble and all that kind of stuff. But their origins are pretty ugly from that standpoint. And Wilt, there's a quote from him in the book. He took the money with the Globetrotters, but he did it because that was where all the black players who he grew up admiring, that's where they were going to play. So that's where he wanted to go play. So Wilt was a really in-demand guy, no question.
Yeah, if you don't mind, since we're on the topic, let's stay on that. 1948, you talk about that chapter between them against the Los Angeles Lakers. What decided for you to put that in there for that chapter? So that is an unknown story now, and today's generation, they probably know the Globetrotters as this comical team, mediocre basketball, play around, goofball, but they were actually a real professional team.
Yeah, exactly. They're like the exhibition team that comes to town and puts on a circus show and moves on. But back in the day, while they did put an emphasis on kind of putting on a show, they were doing a lot of like dribbling moves and hide the ball behind your head, all this kind of stuff that just wasn't being done then. And it was only because they had super talented guys like Goose Tatum and whatnot who were playing for them. But the story you're alluding to is when the Globetrotters played an exhibition game against the then Minneapolis Lakers, who had George Mikan, the NBA's first star, another big center, and they were considered the best team in the world. And they played the Globetrotters in this exhibition game, and they lost. And then they had a rematch the next year, and they lost again. And the year after that was when we saw the first black players join the NBA. So there's a direct link between. The line I use in the book, I believe, is something like the NBA could no longer claim that they were where the best basketball players play. This white league is getting beat by the Globetrotters, and they just can't justify the statement that like, hey, we have the top talent, because it was clear that they didn't. So they started doing something about it. They started integrating their league. But the reason that story's in the book, I'm really glad you pointed to that one. I had years ago done a feature on the Globetrotters, like a long form feature on Sportsnet.ca, which is a Canadian ESPN. And that story, and doing the research for that, there was so much amazing history with the Globetrotters that I wasn't aware of, that I know a lot of people weren't aware of, that came up while researching the story. And that story was about how the Globetrotters were kind of used as pawns by the government to be like ambassadors for the U.S. So the U.S. government would pay for them to go travel Europe and whatnot and put on these shows, and they were like these big stars. And for the government, they were trying to get this message across that, look, like America can't be that bad of a place to live if you're a black person, because look at how happy these players are. Look at how talented they are. Look, they're the stars of the show. You're paying to come see their show. How can we be a terrible place for black people when these are our big stars we're showing you? Which was obviously total bullshit, a total falsity. And so that's how the Globetrotters were being manipulated. In researching that story, I came across the thing about this Globetrotters Lakers exhibition game, and in the original story I did online, it's just like a sentence in that piece. And I knew if I ever had the chance to dive deeper into that Globetrotters Lakers rivalry, I was going to do it. And this book was just the perfect opportunity, because that game, I don't want to ramble too much, but that game happened in the backdrop of some just crazy shit that was happening. There had been a really famous, like infamous lynching that had happened like that week, and the president was doing a huge address to the nation about how this kind of stuff has to stop. We need to like come together. And it was like that same night that the Globetrotters and Lakers played, like a black team versus a white team, in front of like 50,000 fans at a Chicago stadium. So it was a huge event happening at a really crucial time, and I think it ended up inadvertently playing a big role in kind of changing the course of NBA history and speeding up that integration.
Mm-hmm. Let's fast forward to 1967, the ABA.
The best.
You had teams like the St. Louis St. Louis Spirits, the Charleston Cougars, Denver Rockets, which became the Houston Rockets subsequently later.
Mm-hmm.
Just talk about how much they played an impact and the innovation of the game, 3-point line. Do you still have the NBA what it is today if you don't add those teams?
No, I mean maybe eventually. So, and it's not even about adding those teams. So yeah, there's a few ABA teams ended up merging with the NBA.
Right.
They were kind of swallowed up by the NBA because the ABA was faltering. You mentioned it was the San Antonio Spurs were one, Indiana Pacers, Denver Nuggets. There's a couple more, but maybe eventually you would see the NBA become what it is now. But at the time, the ABA was, you mentioned the 3-point shot.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't exist in the NBA. That was an ABA invention. So today's NBA, especially where it's all about the threes, the ABA introduced 3-point shots. The ABA introduced dunking as a thing you would do in a game, something to entertain the crowd, to send a message to the other team, to fire your own team up, whatever it is, to put on a show. Guys didn't dunk in the NBA. It was considered like passe, or I don't even know why. I can't wrap my head around the reason for not wanting to do that. But the ABA had the first dunk contest ever. It really put an emphasis on guys playing with style, for better and for worse. They had a ton of really high scoring games that probably had like infuriating defense to watch. But yeah, their emphasis on style and personalities. That's where the guys had the huge fros and would wear the striped socks and just have more personal style, like cool goatees and like dumb crap like that like we don't really think about being important. And I'm not saying it's important necessarily, but they shape how we experience watching basketball and our relationship with these players as fans and consumers. And the ABA had a huge role in shaping basketball as it is today. I think you can say that without any doubt. To say nothing of the fact that a lot of the ABA stars came over to the NBA and became NBA stars, like Dr. J. Dr. J was like the biggest basketball player in the world, one of the most famous athletes in the world, certainly in North America. And he was an ABA player who came over in the merger. Artis Gilmore, David Thompson, Skywalker. So there's a ton of talent that came into the NBA that helped shape things as well. I don't think enough can be said about the impact of the ABA.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up players like Artis Gilmore, who played for the Chicago Bulls. Dr. J, we already know how his resume is. And I'm glad we're talking about this now because it's kind of transitioning back to fast forward to the chapter about Streetball in 1974, which you talked about how the game is evolving. I don't know if you read this book by Dr. Todd Boyd, Young Black, Rich and Famous. He talked about how the basketball game at first was more like a synchronized band, and then all of a sudden it became more like jazz.
I love that. Yeah.
It no longer became a coach's game, but more of a player's game, which later led to players like Larry Bird and Michael Jordan leading their team to greatness.
That's a great point. Like the transition from a coach's game to a player's game. I love that. Yeah, and you can see that happening on like the Rucker Park courts and where Dr. J was playing before he went to college in New Jersey. So I think there's a huge link with that, and I think in my mind at least, like I kind of tie the ABA into that. It's all similar message, which is that like, hey, let's put a premium on individuality. Let's put a premium on pushing the limits of what we can do with the basketball in our hands, you know. And it's on like those exhibition street games are where that was happening. And you know, slowly they eventually showed up on hardwood courts, you know, in college basketball and in the pros. But it took a while, and you had to go onto like the blacktop, the concrete, to find that kind of flair and style. And then you had a lot of guys who were handcuffed when they did go to try to play normally, or to try to play like professionally or in college. Like with Earl the Pro Monroe, that was always a story with him, that he felt restrained a little bit when he started off. And there's a lot of guys like that. So that was like an important laboratory, I think, for growing the game of basketball.
1980, you had a chapter about Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. Now, there's been multiple interviews, documentaries, books. When the Game Was Ours by Jackie McMullen, that's one of my favorite books, basketball books. Obviously, that probably would have been a chapter if you didn't put in. People would have said, "Hey, what's going on?" So
yeah, that was like,
why did you? I know why you added it, but what made your chapter and story different than other sites?
I don't know. I hope it's a little different. I can't promise that it is, because like you're saying, we're talking about two of the most covered guys out there, especially as the years go on. I think a lot of people, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the first half of the book. I think a lot of people kind of start their basketball history with like Jordan and with Bird and Magic in kind of 1980. And before that is what we really tend to forget. And part of that is because afterwards it was all televised to a degree, and before it wasn't, you know. So that plays a big part of it. The approach I tried to take with the Magic and Larry chapter was to show their kind of parallel rise and how their careers, on their own, they had Hall of Fame incredible careers, but they were always linked ever since college. You know, they played in the championship game in college, and ever since then they were always interlinked. So then they both had a rookie year in 1980, the same year. Always being compared against each other. You know, Magic talks about looking for Larry Bird's stats in the box score every morning with his like coffee and breakfast. The two were always connected, and I just really tried to show how, while everything else was happening around them, it always came back to Magic versus Larry. It's like the story of that entire decade of the 80s. It always came back to Magic and Larry. The other significant part about that I tried to get across in the chapter was the fact that the NBA was in really bad shape before they arrived. It was, you know, they call it the cocaine era. It was a lot of guys like the ABA stars who then came to the NBA, got more famous, maybe got corrupted in some way, and there was a lot of players. David Thompson comes to mind. There's a ton of examples of guys who were ostensibly in their prime, should have been performing as that, but they were always disappointing. They'd be ghosts on some nights. It was just like it was a poor product. And as a result, I mentioned like games weren't televised. Infamously, I think it was the '79 finals were shown on tape delay, which you couldn't imagine that now. Imagine the Lakers playing the Heat in the bubble, and the game's at 7:30, but they tape delay and they show the game at like midnight. They aired at midnight because they didn't want to preempt like the news or whatever else was on TV. I mean, that's how like lowly people thought of the NBA. It was not a big league. It was not considered big time, at least compared to like the NFL or baseball. So the league had a long way to go. And I think it's Magic and Larry, them coming in, these fresh faces. Everyone had heard about them because of their college rivalry. They came in. They were amazing right from the start. You look at their rookie league highlights. Magic Johnson, Finals MVP his rookie year. These guys were just incredible from the start. And I think it was really the spark plug that the league needed to be legitimate, to have people take them seriously. And kind of everything we see now, how big the league is, how all the people it reaches, I think it all comes back to those two.
Let's fast forward to 1995. You have a chapter called "The NBA Comes to Canada."
Close to my heart.
How was that like writing that chapter?
That one was like, it was tough because there was a lot more I wanted to say. I'm Canadian. I'm from Toronto. We're talking about the Toronto Raptors starting and the Vancouver Grizzlies as well, who are now the Memphis Grizzlies. There was just a lot to say there. I'd come from, writing about covering the Raptors on like a almost daily basis and writing about basketball in Canada. So there's just like all these moments in the franchise history. I felt we needed to kind of get it all in there. But then I realized like, the story is just about the NBA expanding to another country, which is a pretty significant moment in their history. And just how they were able to create a foothold in Canada. It took a long time. I would argue it wasn't until the 2019 when the Raptors won the championship that we saw like real strong numbers of basketball fans. As successful as the Raptors were before making the playoffs and whatnot, like stuff like television ratings were always pretty low. Famously up here in Canada, curling always outdrew NBA basketball on TV in terms of ratings numbers, which drove me nuts. I could never understand that. But so it took a while, and I want to tell the story of how the league popularized in Canada and how they expanded internationally. And it's also interesting to see how it worked in Toronto and how it really didn't work in Vancouver. How long were they there? They were only there a few years until they moved back. They moved down to Memphis. So just an interesting way to see how the factors in play to allow one team to kind of soar and become popular, another team to absolutely crash and have to move town.
Right. For you being in that area, because I was pretty young when that happened, when that move happened, how was the experience like? Was people really more receptive of having a basketball team there, or like, okay?
It took a really long time. It took a really long time. Vince Carter, his rise in like 99, 2000, that's when he started first getting like the general Canadian or Toronto, at least sports fan being like, oh, Raptors, basketball, NBA, what's this? Vince was really like the figure. He was like the before and after for basketball in Canada. It's before Vince and after Vince. But before that, they had some talented players like Damon Stoudemire, Mighty Mouse. He was like a fan favorite among here. But the thing is, you had a really small audience. Right. They were playing out of the Sky Dome, which is like the Blue Jays stadium, a huge, I think fits like 75,000 people or 80,000. And they were playing in the Sky Dome at first with like most of the arena blocked off. So it just like always looked wrong. It looked off. So you can probably hear my dogs in the background. But it was a slow start. I mean, people were like, this is a cool novelty, but like, what is basketball? It was kind of like a general thing. They would put like explainers for like rules in the seats for some of the early games. And it was there, but it wasn't that popular. The Raptors, they beat, in their first season, it was the 96 season, they beat Jordan and the Bulls. And that was the year that they had set the record for most wins in a season. And they beat them that year, which is like a huge deal. They were one of 6 teams to beat them that year. And at the time, it came and went with a whimper. It's only like we look back at it and make a bigger deal than we did at the time. So basketball was just secondary. Vince came along, made it popular, And then really, like I said, it was winning the championship. Toronto's a great sports town, but it's absolutely a bandwagon sports town. So when you started having a championship caliber team, that's when
Right.
people really started to notice. So it took
97.
20 years. It took 20
Right.
years.
Yeah, 97. You gave which I really respected this chapter. You gave a dedication to the WNBA. It's called We Got Next.
Yeah.
Obviously, there were players like Cheryl Miller who was not
Mhm.
able to meet that time. She was already beyond her prime when that happened. So obviously, it wasn't really a league for her to
Yeah.
go to, obviously overseas, but it was
Mhm.
something more structured like what we have now. How was the process of writing that chapter?
Um, Rewarding and frustrating, because it was like, this is a huge story. It was really from the very beginning. We were like, we're definitely going to make sure we talk about the women's game. You mentioned Cheryl Miller. She was someone who kept in mind. I had done a few interviews in the past with Nancy Lieberman, who was a really big figure in women's hoops in like the 70s and
Yeah.
80s and whatnot. I think she was the first woman to play in a men's professional league. But it's kind of sad that, like, if you're at that town, you have to play in a men's league because there's not a league. There's not a strong enough women's league. So it was really important for us to tell that story. And I say it was frustrating because it was one chapter in a book. It could be its own book.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll be the next thing I work on. Like, I should be its own book. But I'm glad we were able to include it. It's really important to talk about how the WNBA came to be, the success it's had, the way it's been able to show a lot of young, talented women's players that there is somewhere where you can go to, you can stay in America and foster your talent and have a place to play. There's a long way to go still. I think of, like, in terms of like pay inequities, it's just wild. So there's a long way to go still. And I think, like, here in Canada, like they can expand to Toronto, where there's a lot of like really talented Canadian female hoopers who could use that kind of role model to point to and say, I could be that. And so it was important to tell the WNBA story. And like I said, like, let's keep telling it. There's a lot more to tell.
Dave, what do you want your readers to take away from this book? If it's one thing, what do you like them to take away from this book?
Wow.
Life lesson.
You know what? I think I would want the reader to have more of an appreciation of what these players went through in the early days of the league. And you know what? Not even just the early days in the league, but just like, I want them to get a sense of the stories of a lot of these guys, the hardships that they went through. We see them on the court doing their thing as, celebrities and big stars. Maybe some people resent them or think, all these like rich guys, they got it made. And I really wanted to show like the struggles of, especially when we talk about the racial garbage that guys had to deal with at the beginning. I'm obviously talking about the black players, but also like, the Jewish players at the beginning, they're being written about in just disgusting ways at the beginning of the league. I just really wanted to get a sense of how much people had to go through to get the game of basketball where it is today, and that process. I just don't think people appreciate enough how something goes from nothing to where it is today, and what people have to overcome to make that happen. Yeah.
With all the stories that you write about in this book, do you see maybe a plan how the next 25 years is going to look like, and how? It's
so hard to predict. I mean, first of all, like, I can tell you when we do the next 25 years, we spent a lot of time on 2020, on this past year. We went back, and so I don't know if this is relevant. After I finished the writing, submitted the stuff. It was after I submitted all the writing that the bubble happened, that the league shut down, and we were able to go back and add something about it. But like, man, right. Talk about a crazy year that would have deserved its own chapter. Going forward, I think the stories will be about the continued growth, kind of like the global takeover aspect. We're just going to see how this game is going to keep growing and growing. Probably more emphasis on how people get to, like, the people's paths to the NBA and how that will change. I think about guys like Jalen Green and Jonathan Kuminga. I think I'm saying those right. These high school kids who are going to be skipping college and going to the G League next season. I just think there's going to be a lot will change in terms of where players come from, how they develop, and how the rest of the world accesses them. So that's like a main thing I think would be worth keeping track of over the next 25 years. But hey, it's hard to predict this stuff. I mean, you look back 25 years, a lot has happened and you couldn't have predicted it. So I don't know. I'll be watching along with everyone else.
Well, Dave, I appreciate you doing this, man. You're just a really great read, straightforward